realized that I started this, I don't know how long, video series on doing your Jewish genealogy without explicitly saying which Jews I'm making this series for. Because, of course, as you know, the Jewish community is very large and heterogeneous. We are not all from the same background or with the same genealogical origins. So what I'm really doing is I'm making a video for people like myself, because I'm not a professional genealogist or anything like that. I'm basing this on what I've learned doing my own family tree. And my own family tree is, as with many of you, I'm sure, Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jewish. And I'm also specifically, well, mostly making it for those of us whose families came to the West, but often quite a bit before World War II. My cat's asking for my attention. But I think a lot of this information will be useful to people whose families were stuck in the East during World War II, during the Holocaust, and who now may be still in Eastern Europe or have moved out to other places, including Israel, America, etc. But the main thing is I'm talking to Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews. Those of you who were, if you are Western, probably told that your family came from Russia, which, by the way, and we'll get into this a little bit in this video, is probably not actually true. They're probably not actually from Russia, but instead from the Pale of Settlement, which is an area where Jews were permitted to live and was not actually Russia proper. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as I move forward. I wrote some notes so I don't miss anything out, because this is going to actually require a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit about genetics, so a little bit of Jewish history, our migration patterns, how we ended up in Eastern Europe, and what an Ashkenazi Jew is. What is that? As opposed to, say, a Sephardi or a Mizrahi Jew, which are two of the other major groups of Jews that people may have heard of. And there are some misconceptions about who they are as well, and there are still other groups. There are African Jews, for example. Anyway, I'm going to be looking at my notes here. The first thing I want to say is that many of you whose Eastern European Jewish families are in the West and have been in the West for some time, your families were probably escaping the pogroms, which is something that a lot of us have heard of. Not all of us, but a lot of us have heard of. The pogroms were in Eastern Europe, government sanctioned, and this is really important, government sanctioned riots against Jews. We hear a lot about how this was a destruction of Jewish property, but it was a lot more than that. It was a lot of violence against Jews. It was a lot of rape of Jews, and it was murder as well. My grandfather, who was a young child when his family moved from Lithuania to New York, all his life had a scar on his face from the kick of a Cossack's horse. A Cossack was a Russian military man, and the Cossacks were often involved in the pogroms. So this was kind of standard, and they got really bad at a certain point, and this is when Jews started moving en masse, predominantly to New York, but not only to New York, to other Western countries as well. Starting around 1880, my grandmother's family came to New York in, I think, 1883, which was very early, all the way up to 1924. And 1924 is a very specific cutoff time, because at that time America, distressed by the influx of what they literally referred to as racially inferior immigrants, i.e. Jews and Italians. So there's a huge amount of racism in this. Distressed about that, put much higher restrictions on who could come into America. And this was really, like I say, specifically targeted at Jews and some other groups. So at that point, Jews who were still trying to get out away from the persecution started going even more to other places, especially South Africa and Argentina, and I have heard Zimbabwe, which was at that time called Rhodesia, because there were already significant Jewish populations in those areas. I found I have family in both of those places. So I'm talking predominantly to you. Sorry, I want to back up for just a second. It wasn't only the pogroms that our families were running from. There were also just overall, there was a great deal of systemic anti-Semitism with a lot of very repressive laws. I was shocked. I knew it was bad, but I didn't know how bad. Laws about, say, where we could live, what education we could or more likely could not get, whether or not we could get a mortgage, what kinds of careers we were allowed to have, what kinds of extra taxes we would have because they knew we needed candles for our Shabbat services, etc., etc., etc. So they were also escaping a great deal of very systemic oppression and then just overall intense anti-Semitism. So I'm talking to those of us, as I'm talking about doing our genealogy, I'm talking to those of us who have that family history. And also, I think a lot of what I'm telling will be equally useful to those whose families did not leave. And which means you, if you're listening to this are descended from a family that did not leave, are probably the descendant of a Holocaust survivor, or perhaps a Russian evacuee. That's a topic for another video. So we're all Ashkenazi. I'm talking to Ashkenazi Jews. So what is an Ashkenazi Jew? We are not a race. Nobody is a race. Race is a sort of a made-up term used to, oppress others. But we are a very distinct ethnic group. Where our ethnicity is distinct enough that it shows up as its own thing on a DNA test. So how did that happen? We know, obviously, I mean, it's not, just to know the history of Jews is to know that we're originally from the Middle East, from the area that is now called Israel, and was called Israel at certain times, and Judah, etc., etc. My husband, by the way, makes a lot of interesting videos about this very early history. I might put some links to that. So we're obviously from there originally, but then we were in Europe. So how did that happen, and how did we start looking the way many of some of the way Ashkenazi Jews now, which is, obviously the most notable thing is our lighter skin. We're obviously not completely Middle Eastern anymore. How did that happen? And also things like red. A lot of us have red or reddish hair. Mine is auburn in the right light. I always wished it was more red, but oh well, my dad's was. A lot of us have quite slanted eyes. Where did those come from? And so before we had the modern technology to actually find out with DNA technology, there were a lot of rumors. And one of the rumors I've heard often from Jews is that we intermixed with the Mongols, which is an interesting theory, and it would explain the slanted eyes, and I suppose the lighter skin too. But it's not true. All these various theories that people had that made sense are not true. For a long time, people then thought that we had mixed with Germanic people because we migrated to Germanic areas in Central and Western Europe around 1000 BC, so Common Era. So people thought maybe we mixed with Germans and we got the lighter skin that way. That is also not true. And what I'm going to tell you now, as is the latest scholarship on this, is going to make sense once you think about it for a second. So, at some point, pretty early on, even while the Christian Bible was still being sort of unfolding, the events in it were still unfolding, some Jews were migrating to southern Europe, places like Italy, Greece, etc. And then by as hundreds of years went by, the Jewish population in that area became fairly large. Although I gather it was I don't know if it's predominantly male, but there was at least a group of Middle Eastern Jewish males who had children with, wait for it, Italian women. So at this point, the belief is that Ashkenazi Jews are about 70% Middle Eastern and about 30% Italian, which, when you think about it, makes a hell of a lot of sense. I happen to live in the little Italy of my own city and have done so for a long time, and the Italians and the Jews are constantly talking about how much we look alike. And if you haven't noticed that, well, take a look and you'll notice. And well, because we kind of are. So when I learned that, and this is very recent scholarship, I thought that was pretty cool. Now keep in mind, any kind of scholarship asking questions about the genetic origins of Ashkenazi Jews is going to be fraught with some controversy and some concerns. So this is what's out there right now. This may change. I don't know. I have read that maybe we are also mixed with Eastern Europeans. We'll see. But that's not that important for the purposes of what I'm doing with you today. So we were already a mixed group when we moved northward to, my cat keeps walking by. His name, by the way, is Ketzel, which means kitten in Yiddish. Anyway, so Jews moved northward into the Germanic areas and somewhat northwest as well into more Central Europe itself. And by this time we were, or around this time, it's a little unclear, somewhere around here we became this distinct ethnic group that we are today. And the main reason that this happened is, while originally these Jewish men, these Middle Eastern Jewish men, married European women, they their offspring did not marry outside of that community. So we became what's known as endogamous. We married and had children within our community and did not mix our DNA with other European groups at that point. And so we then became this genetically distinct group. I find it helpful to think of the Métis in the Americas here, or in North America here, who were originally a group of indigenous people, or groups of indigenous people who intermarried with and had children with Europeans, people of European descent, but then after that did not keep marrying outside of that group, and so they mixed European indigenous people, married mixed European indigenous people, and so on, and became a distinct ethnic and cultural group, the Métis. That is similar to Ashkenazi Jews, although in our case it goes even further back than that, hundreds of years further back than that. So that's how we became what we are, Ashkenazi, as opposed to Sephardi, as opposed to Mizrahi, etc. By about the year 1300, we were being pushed out of Central and Western Europe by the Crusades, where they were, massacring Jews, the Christian Crusades, and by laws that were expelling us from these countries. We were being told that we couldn't live in these places anymore. And it was by about 1400, the largest group of Ashkenazi Jews were in Poland, which is Eastern Europe. By the late 1700s, which was just a pretty big leap forward, but just sort of imagine Jews more and more and more becoming Eastern European, associated with Eastern Europe as one of the biggest communities during those few hundred years. By the late 1700s, the Russian Empire, as opposed to Russia itself, so there's Russia, and then it's collected a bunch of little countries around it as part of its empire. So the Russian Empire decided that Jews had to be restricted to living in one area specifically and nowhere else. We were literally not allowed to live anywhere else outside of an area called the Pale of Settlement. Now, the Pale of Settlement included, and I might get this a little bit wrong because it shifted over time, and sometimes it's only a part of a country or not the whole country, but it consisted of parts of Latvia, as far as I know, all of Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, not Russia. So keep that in mind. We were in the Russian Empire, but we were not in Russia. So most of us in the West were told that we were from Russia, and the documents that we have, immigration papers, arrivals at Ellis Island, or whatever we have, or whatever we can find online of our family's arrival, will often say that our grandparents, great-grandparents, whomever, were from Russia. We were not usually, sometimes. We were from the Russian Empire and probably the Pale of Settlement. So my family heritage I've found is Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, and a little bit of Poland. So basically the Pale of Settlement. And you will find this as well, unless there's some very rare circumstances. I had one family branch who were amazingly official photographers to 3 czars, Russian czars, and they had special permission as Jews to live in St. Petersburg, I believe. So they were allowed to live in Russia, but they had to have permission to do so. So this is by the late 1700s that this is getting sort of codified into law. This is also the time, and I talked about this in my last video, when Jews were legally forced to take last names. Before that, we had used other ways of identifying each other. And because we didn't have last names before that, you're going to have a very, very hard time tracing your family back any earlier than the mid to late 1700s. Usually anything that you find that goes further back than that is going to be some speculation, unless perhaps one of your ancestors was famous or something, and so there were documents about him or her, usually him in that case. In fact, you'll often find no documents even going back that far, but you will find documents, say, from 1820 about a birth to parents who were born, say, in 1790, and then you can extrapolate from there, and then, that'll take you back a generation or two. The furthest back I've gotten, I believe, is the early 1700s, and even then I'm a little skeptical and cautious in that information. But the documents that are available start around 1800. So let's get back to the topic of endogamy. We've now taken ourselves to Eastern Europe, to the Pale of Settlement, talked about how far back documents of our families go. I talked about endogamy earlier, so let's talk about that again. It's what made us a specific ethnic group, the Ashkenazi Jews, and it came about because we married within our community and not outside of it, like practically at all. and yes, if we married outside of our group, some of us might have been banished from the Jewish community. That's a whole other story that you might find in some branches. So, Jewish endogamy, we're marrying within our group. Our group is large, but not huge. So what does this mean practically? Well, it means we're all cousins. It means, in other words, we were marrying our cousins because in order to stay within the group, in order to marry within the group. But I don't mean in a creepy way. So first of all, we're going back to like 1800 and earlier, and moving forward. At that time, in every community, Jewish or non, marrying first cousins was pretty common. Now, first cousins are, you share a set of grandparents. You have the same grandparents, which is pretty closely related. And we now know that's kind of creepy from a genetic perspective and can lead to health problems for your children, especially if you do it several times over. But at the time, marrying first cousins was just normal. What the hell's his name? Darwin was married to his first cousin and was pretty worried about this as he started to learn about evolution and genetics and stuff. But that did happen in our families, and I have found some examples of it, but it wasn't all that common. Much more common was distant cousins marrying each other, perhaps not even aware that they were distant cousins. I mean, do you know who your fifth cousin is? Because, okay, I do, but that's because I've done this genealogical research. Most people wouldn't even know. But marrying distant cousins over and over and over again. So these two marry distant cousins, their kids marry distant cousins, their kids marry distant cousins. So what ends up happening is that most Ashkenazi Jews, let's be honest, we're related to each other. Most of us are cousins somehow, but distantly repeatedly. So we're distant cousins several times over a lot of the time. What does that mean in terms of doing your genealogy? Well, first of all, it means that you are going to have a lot, and I mean thousands of cousins, DNA-related cousins. If you're of mixed heritage, which I am, my father's side is entirely Jewish, my mother's side is mostly not Jewish, although not entirely not Jewish. So on this side, on my mother's side, I have quite a few cousins, but, a manageable number. On my father's side, I've thousands and thousands and thousands of genetically related DNA cousins. So, oh my God, what do you do with that? Well, here's the problem. A lot of people think, oh, I do my DNA, I find cousins, I learn my family tree, done. That's how you do your genealogy. Well, no, that's not true for anybody of any background, but it sure as hell is not true for Ashkenazi Jews. Because if you are related to this person over here, distantly, but several times you're related to this person distantly, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is you're going to get a falsely close DNA match. So maybe you're 10th cousins, but 10 times over or something. I'm not doing math here. Suddenly it's going to claim that you're 4th or 5th cousins. And you're not. You're actually not. And you're going to bang your head against a wall trying to figure out how you're related. And you're probably not going to figure it out because at that point it becomes impossible. So generally speaking, when Jews are giving each other advice about how to deal with DNA links, DNA cousins, and they're almost all cousins. You will find some aunts, uncles, etc., but it's mostly cousins. We are told to just ignore anything 4th cousins and up, 4th, 5th, 6th cousins. Don't even bother with those because you're not going to be able to figure it out, and it's probably a falsely close DNA link. They're actually probably more distantly related, just several times over. So basically, we're told to start with third cousins and go down. So first, second, and third cousins. So that means first cousin, you share a set of grandparents. Great. You're not going to have a problem figuring that out if you have a bit of paperwork knowledge. Second cousins, you share a set of great-grandparents. Not too bad. Third cousins, you share a set of great-great-grandparents, which is most definitely getting you back to the old country at this point. Now you're back in the Pale of Settlement for sure by then. Except that some of the very elderly did migrate here around 1900, 1880, etc. So some exceptions. But they were born back there. So that's frustrating. You know, I make a distant cousin match on my maternal side, and I can actually usually figure out how I'm related to them. They could be like a seventh cousin, and I can actually figure it out, both because those documents go further back than 1800 and because there wasn't as much endogamy going on. I find a fourth cousin on my paternal side, and oh my God, I bang my head against a wall trying to figure out how we're related. That said, you know, I have had some luck with fourth cousin matches. This has happened, maybe there's several fourth cousin matches who all have the same last name, and it's an unusual enough name that I know it's not just a coincidence. Like if it were Bloom, for example, I'm not going to worry about that too much because it's the Jewish equivalent of Smith or Jones. It doesn't really tell me anything. But if the last name is unusual enough and I get a lot of, say, fourth or fifth cousin matches with the same name, that might be something to take a look at. I just found an entire family branch that way of Lawendas. I'd never even heard that as a Jewish name, but apparently it is. Or you're lucky enough to just talk to someone, you know, make a match with, say, a fourth cousin who has also done a lot of genealogy, and therefore you're actually able to look at each other's trees and go, oh my God, there's the connection. And it isn't a result of Jewish endogamy. You're related several times over, but it really is that you do share this set of great-great-great-grandparents or whatever. But my general advice is don't bother with anything beyond a third cousin because it's going to drive you absolutely mental. And it won't be very useful. So the upshot of all of this is that yes, doing your DNA is helpful for one thing because Ashkenazis are a distinct ethnic group. You'll find out, am I really Jewish? How Jewish am I? You might get a little bit of a sense of, are you Jewish on this side of the family, that side of the family, both sides? Were there any surprises? Did you not know you were Jewish at all? But now you find out you have a Jewish grandparent. Did you think you were fully Jewish? And oh my God, you're not. So because Ashkenazi is a distinct ethnic group, that's really, you know, helpful for doing your genealogy. But old-fashioned paperwork is going to be more helpful. Now, obviously, you're asking me, how do I do that old-fashioned paperwork? Well, that's going to be another video. The good news is that most of it, the vast majority of it, is now online. That's the very, very good news. And that which isn't, you can sometimes get copies sent to you online. The bad news is it's hard and it's a learning curve. So, okay, so your takeaways. Ashkenazi is a distinct ethnic group that you can see on your DNA. You are probably not from Russia proper, but from the Pale of Settlement. And you can't really trust anything more than a third cousin match. And I think that's all for today. I hope it wasn't too much. If you got bogged down and a little confused about some of the history or some of the genetics, just remember those 3 takeaways. Those are the main things you have to keep in mind. And if you forget what's a third cousin, what's a second cousin, first of all, most DNA companies will just tell you that this person is a second cousin match or a third cousin match. And second of all, you could just Google cousin chart or something, and it'll show you how that works. So, good luck to one and all. And maybe my cats will make an appearance in the next video, which will probably start getting into which websites will be helpful for you moving forward.